Have you ever driven down a highway and found yourself to be completely lost, both in a physical and spiritual sense? You have no idea where you are, where you're going, or what the true meaning of life really is. But luckily, there's salvation in the form of Jesus Christ. Yeah. But Jesus works in mysterious ways. He doesn't reveal himself through an angel or directions, but rather through a billboard. With such classics as Where Are You Going? Heaven or Hell? Or Historically Reliable? Or my personal favorite, Dare to Investigate. Which is exactly what I'm going to be doing here today, my friends, investigating. I am going to call the folks over at Gospel Billboards to really learn about life, death, and my main man, Jesus Christ. And, of course, a lot of things with the Bible itself. Now, just a little bit of a disclaimer before I start. I'm sorry, but this conversation is not going to be hostile. I'm not calling these people in order to completely bash their beliefs and insult them. And while I do fundamentally disagree with a lot of what they're saying, my goal is not to belittle their beliefs, but rather entertain them to an extent, and more importantly, question them. See how exactly those beliefs were formed and how they shape this person's current views of the world today. I want to allow them to find holes in their argument and really begin to ask the questions themselves, rather than looking at one book with all the answers and opposing any conflicting answers. And since you're here, welcome. As you can see, my channel is very tiny, and that's okay. I'm used to having tiny things. Although, I'd like to appreciate the time that it is small, because I can actually engage with every single one of you watching this video. So, leave comments, engage with what I'm talking about here, whether it's in agreement, disagreement, because I'd love to discuss them with you. I'm small enough that I can get on a call with you, and we can discuss this stuff, whether you want to talk about it. And of course, do the like and subscribe thing, I have to tell you to do these things because I always forget to do them myself. And, so sit back, enjoy the call, do your laundry or something while you listen. And if you don't make it to the end of the video, which it's very unlikely that you will, thanks for stopping by to begin with. So, let's get right into this, shall we?
Hello, this is Philip with Gospel Billboards. How are you today?
Hi, Philip. I'm doing quite well. How about yourself?
Just fine, thank you. Did you see one of our signs?
Yes, I did. I've seen your signs a good amount of times, actually.
Okay, sure. Is any particular one of them stood out in your mind?
Yeah, so, there's just like a few of them. What is it? I guess, like, I don't even know where to start here. Here, let's start with this one right here. What is it? Historically reliable. So, could you get into just like a little bit of just like the historical reliability behind the Bible in general? Because I'm just going to preface this a little bit because, I've had, I've just been questioning quite a few things just in general, just about like life, the universe, what's going on with everything that's happening and, what's it all really mean? And, I'm kind of curious to see what your thoughts are on about it.
Sure. Yeah, so thinking about the historical reliability, there's not a whole lot of debate about the epistles or the letters written by the apostles in the latter part of the New Testament. And there's really not historically any real significant debate about the Gospels either. It's just that the discussion tends to center more around the Gospels because they are, the story of the life and teachings of Jesus, the central figure of Christianity. And especially around the resurrection, there's questions that are posed, especially by unbelievers, about the reliability of the account of the resurrection. But the historical reliability of the New Testament as a standard of a historical document is very, very strong. Especially the corroboration of the events that they found through archaeology, as well as sources outside of Christian authorship. And so the New Testament is a very reliable historical document, and
So,
is
just real quick.
agreed by...
Oh, just real quick. Sorry to cut
What's
you
that?
off. I'm sorry to cut you off.
No
Just kind
problem.
of curious. So, like, what are some of, like, you're saying there's a bunch of, like, archaeological evidence and things along those lines. I know there's archaeological evidence of the Gospels and, like, where they were originally written and what language they were originally written in. But I'm more curious, like, specifically when you're talking about the resurrection, what is the historical, archaeological findings that really date to the resurrection?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that there's specifically ones that, at least they come to my mind right now, that relate to the resurrection. When we talk about the reliability of a document, we look at what connections we can make, and the more they're consistent with the things that we find, the more we trust the stuff that we can't find particular information about.
Okay.
Because the sources that we have are accurate. For instance, especially like the Gospel of Luke, which gives a lot of dates as well as, or not dates specifically as in time frames, but rather as in
Timepieces.
datable information such as the kings that were ruling in Jerusalem and things like that. They've discovered things archaeologically that just have time after time lined up with Luke's gospel. And so that continually adds, as they find new things, that continually adds credibility archaeologically from the archaeological findings to the document.
So, like, who's finding these things specifically? Like, what archaeological teams? I'm not really too familiar with archaeology and, like, exactly how the structure for it works. So, like, what are some, specific, like, sources that I can look towards and see, like, the exact archaeological evidence of the Gospel of Luke specifically? I mean, if you're talking in that sense of that being true, and then compared to, like, the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, or John as well.
Yeah. So one of the sources that I have used in the past has been it's a video that is put up by people who study historical documents, and that's called Jesus of Testimony. That document is. I can't think of the name of the historical scholar that.
No, it's all
that
right.
reviews that, but if you can find it on YouTube.
Yeah. Richard
Very
Buckman, I
well-known
have it up right
historical
here.
scholar. Gary Habermas does a lot of work on more specifically the resurrection, but also on the Gospels. He's a historian that has done quite a bit of research and debated quite a bit with people who want to challenge the historicity of the Gospels. He would be a good source of someone who can present
What'd you
the
say his
different
name was?
evidences of Gary Habermas. Habermas, I believe, is the correct spelling.
Gotcha.
Both of those sources are good. I've read some about the archaeological findings, but I don't know much about the teams that discovered them. A lot of that stuff has been more broad sweep studies where they've referenced the teams and stuff, and I don't remember that stuff from my reading. Unfortunately, I wish I could retain that stuff.
Okay. So now when it comes to just like historical reliability in the sense, so what about like, let's just say, back in the Old Testament as well, because you've mentioned a lot of the New Testament, and I could definitely understand that there was most definitely some historical person named Jesus. But then when we get into the Old Testament with things like Moses and then the creation story, where things don't exactly line up with many archaeological findings, what would you say there? So like, let's specifically start with the creation story, for example. So what is your take or your perception on the creation story?
Sure. So there's two ways to think about it. One of them is when we start talking about historical events and archaeological finds. So we're referring to things that we find. Okay, so well, let me back up and say this: there is quite a bit of evidence for the historical accuracy of the latter period of the Old Testament, which would have been during the time of the kings, the judges and the kings, the battles that were fought, and the things that they were able to cross-reference even from things written by the enemies of the Israelites in relation to some of the events. Some of that stuff has been found as well as confirmation for certain battles and things that are listed in the
You said the Battle of
Old
Kings.
Testament. So the latter part of the Old Testament, there is a fair amount of that type of stuff for. So, but you're asking about the earlier period.
Yes.
Alphabetic writing came on the scene about the time of the Exodus, which would be, roughly 4,000 years into the biblical time data. And so all of the Bible was written much later than the actual events. Or when I say all the Bible, all the Old Testament, all of those first 5 books, specifically Genesis, was written much later than the actual events. Mm-hmm. In part because there was no alphabetic writing prior to that.
Okay.
However, how do I take the story of the book of of the creation story in Genesis? Looking back now, what we're doing now, looking back, is we are taking information from what we find, and we're evaluating that information. So we dig up a fossil, and I'm talking about scientifically here. We dig up a fossil, we date that fossil by whatever means we have current, current
carbon dating, yes. When it comes to the decay,
deterioration rate.
Mm-hmm.
So they date based on the rates of carbon deterioration, mm-hmm. and that are current. So we're assuming, so we're applying assumption now back into time, that carbon deterioration rates have always been the same, the condition of the earth has always been the same, and so on. So my point is that we need to be just a little bit careful, because as we look back at that and say these are official scientific facts, we need to be a little bit careful, because we are applying some assumptions to the results that we're finding. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not trying in that way to say that all science is bad and false, and no, not at all. I think science is actually very helpful and can align itself very much with a view of the Bible. In fact, I think there are many ways in which it does. But we just need to recognize that every position we take on the beginning of the earth is a position of faith. And yes, we do base that faith, at least at some level, on the evidences that we have at hand and what we actually trust. So the atheistic materialist will say the Earth's 4 billion years old. Well,
then what do you say?
He's postulating back into time. I personally say I'm a young Earth. I believe in a young Earth. Mm-hmm. Now, having said that, my position is, I believe that we can actually learn from science in understanding the Bible. And so, for instance, science helped us to recognize that the Earth was round, and it's pretty obvious in the Scripture that the Earth is round.
Where at? Could you point to which specific scripture it says that?
Well, I can look it up. I don't have it off the tip of my tongue.
Oh no, that's no
but
problem.
there's several references. There's several references to the circle or the sphere of the earth in the Old Testament, and so, but general society believed that the earth was flat up until the Middle Ages.
People knew that the earth was round well before that. Like, what is it? When you go look back to like the ancient Greeks, I believe it was just like Aristotle. I think it was. I don't know exactly which Greek philosopher it was. I'm not too familiar on that subject, but I know that we knew the earth was round for a very long period of time, and it's kind of just meant to diminish people of the past and making them think that they're dumb. But yes, we've known that the earth is round for quite some time now, even predating the Bible.
Yeah, so let's just put it this way, okay? In general, studiers of the Bible believe that the earth was flat until science, through the studies of people who believed, brought evidence to the table, and that shifted the view of people studying the Bible, in Christians specifically, in the Middle Ages. And so what I want to do, my position, I don't hold my position as this is a position that is that I in my own wisdom have a complete grasp on the truth. I hold my position on the basis of what I read and where my level of trust lies. And so I believe that God created a mature earth. The Genesis account gives an account of a mature earth.
The Natur.
Being created.
I'm sorry. What do you mean by Natur? I'm not very familiar with that term.
Well, basically, just for example, Adam was created as a man, not as a baby.
Okay.
So Adam was created mature, as well as trees were created. There weren't seeds planted and sprouted and grew.
Yeah. Sure. Okay.
Trees were created. Things were made in a mature form.
Okay.
We don't know in creating that. We don't know what condition. We don't know that the carbon content of the rocks, for instance, at that time period, was a brand new rock carbon content.
So if it was a brand new rock carbon content,
that,
I'm sorry, if it was a brand new rock carbon content, then wouldn't the predating to, like, what is it? Let's say the mountains, because, God made the mountains. If you, like, I don't even think that carbon dating really works on natural features. But, like, let's say you were to, like, date, something that is natural. All right? Wouldn't it go back to exactly about, like, 6,000 years ago to where you're saying, rather than to about billions of years ago, like scientists are saying?
Well, not particularly, because, for instance, rock forms from lava.
Not all rock.
So Mount St. Helens. Rock formed there. It's been tested. It's been sent to independent labs as a test without verifying the age of the rock or where the rock came from. It's been sent to labs. It's been tested as hundreds of thousands of years old from when Mount St. Helens erupted, and new rocks formed as a result of the lava flow. And so that, my point is that we are assuming, that's what we're assuming. What you just stated is something that we assume, okay, it's going to date 6,000 years ago.
Okay.
If it was all created then it's going to start from that point.
Are you saying that God made things earlier than that creation period? Or, like, essentially put them on there with, like, a preconceived date?
What I'm saying is he created it mature. As he created Adam at 30 years old, say, 30 years old, just to give you an example, we would not have tested Adam on day one and said, well, he's 1 year old, because or one day old, because our concept, our perception of Adam would have been that he was mature. Now, that's obviously a visual perception, but we don't know what the conditions were at the beginning. God could have very well created the earth in a way that it wasn't, it didn't have that same content as, say, Mount St. Helens, for instance, when it erupted and the lava flowed and the condition of that rock on the first day. So my point is that there's just a lot of assumptions
backed by evidence.
That past dating concept that I say we need to be honest about in our claims about what's factual about the beginnings and origins of the earth. Now, is it possible that I do not fully understand what God is saying in those first chapters in Genesis? Very, very possible. There's actually a lot of Christians who are, old earth creationists. They believe God used a process to bring about over long periods of time, and that those first chapters in Genesis are, metaphorical to time periods, and I don't condemn anyone who has that. I personally don't condemn anyone who has that view. It's somewhat peripheral to me to the greater point that God is making, and that greater point is that I am here, and I have brought this into being, and I've brought you into being. I brought this into being because I wanted to bring you into being, and I brought you into being, and you in your own, in my freedom to choose, which gives me both the power to love and the power not to love, to be selfish.
So, okay.
You wandered away from me, or you stepped away from me, and now I've brought together a plan to renew and restore that.
Okay.
That's the bigger picture. Some of these other things, they're more peripheral to that. They're still, with either view of creation, you can still find that deeper message.
Yeah. So here's my question for you then about the story of creation.
Salvation. Go ahead.
So do you think you're saying that it's possible that it could have been metaphorical? Do you think it could have been metaphorical in the sense that it's not even creation, but rather separation from God? I've noticed when I've read the book of Genesis that it focuses a lot about splitting things up, and it could just essentially be a metaphor for man's separation from God rather than, a physical creation of the world. Do you think that's possible?
Yeah, you're talking about like he divided the day from the dark.
Yes.
The light from the darkness. He divided the land from the sea.
Exactly. It's separation.
Divided, there are so many. I tell you what, those first 3 chapters in Genesis are so deep that there's so much we can get from those 3 chapters. And things like that are part of those layers. Someone described depth in a piece of literature as, there's a truth at the surface, and then beneath that there's a truth, and beneath that there's a truth, and you can just keep going down. And in those passages there in Genesis, I think there's just a tremendous depth. I do think that part of that. I would somewhat agree with you. I don't know if that's the deepest level, but I would somewhat agree with you that I think some aspects of that division are part of a representation. For instance, light and darkness are good and evil later on in the scripture.
Okay, so here I have a kind of a follow-up question that regards that then. So when it comes to,
Sure.
like you're saying, how it can be, interpreted and read, and like you can get so many different things out of the Bible, the same way that you can with quite literally any other piece of artwork. I've talked to Muslims who've, said they get that same kind of feeling from the Quran. But at the same time, if it is God's word, why is it so ambiguous? And why is it so, up for interpretation depending on the reader? It just does seem like a work of art rather than an actual historical account. Because when you look at historical accounts, they'll just say, hey, this is exactly what happened. Here's the reasons it happened. Here's the facts. Here's our evidence to back this kind of stuff up. And it's not entertaining and poetic in the sense that the Bible is. And so, like, for example, like, who wrote the first books of the Bible? It's Moses, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so then when it comes to, like, Moses, for example, how could he have written the books of the Bible? Like, well, specifically when it comes to the book of Exodus, he talks about Moses in the third person. He does not say, I did this, I did that, I did all of these things. It is all referred to in the third person. Now, I'm not sure if there's a huge language barrier when it comes to ancient Hebrew and modern English, because it had to get translated multiple different times to get to where it is in this time period today. But it's just something like that. It almost seems like just this Moses label was kind of slapped onto it without any actual evidence of it within the Bible. It's rather just people telling us, yes, this is written by Moses, and people controlling the narrative about what the Bible is, and then creating, their sects of Christianity about it.
Yeah. Well, I won't say that there hasn't been, I certainly will not deny that there hasn't been definitely attempts and even very real happenings in which people did manipulate and have used the scripture to manipulate what is meant and what develops as a result of that. And so I will certainly not deny that. And so my next statement is not at all a denial of that, okay? But part of what I want to point out is that the men who wrote down those books in the Old Testament did not write down that I wrote this. They may have written, I saw this, but this is the word of the Lord. They wrote it in the sense of this is the word of the Lord. Mm-hmm. And so their writing portrays that message very clearly. And I don't actually think that the Bible is written to be, it's not written to be a science textbook. It's not written to be
It's art. It's art.
Yeah, but it's not even specifically written to be that. It's written to be a message.
Laws, art.
From a conscious being, from one conscious being to another.
Okay.
And
isn't that kind of how all messages are kind of perceived? It's, like me and you talking right now, my message is literally one conscious being to another conscious being right now.
Right.
And when you look
right.
when you look back
and
at like
so,
some of the, things that actually happened in the Bible, so like let's say, for example, the Canaanites, everything that happened with them where they were just absolutely slaughtered by the Israelites to take back the Holy Land and, take back their promised land. And with that, it almost doesn't seem like it is truly the work of God, but rather, as you said, from one conscious being to another. It is a person writing this down and then using God as justification for their actions. Or even, if it isn't real, it's people using that story as justifications for their actions today, like what we see going on in Israel right now. So it's interesting exactly how ambiguous it really can be. When you say that it's the word of God, but then so does every other holy book. The Quran says it's the word of God. You got the Book of Mormon that says it's the word of God. It's Joseph Smith is the last prophet. Muhammad's the last prophet. And when you have all of these things that kind of come down, you can really create a narrative around that because it has a controlling matter to it. Because if you're going against this book that is written right here, you are going against the literal creator of the universe. And you don't want to do that because then you will suffer in hell. So
Yeah.
it's just interesting in that sense. Go with what you were saying. I ran out of stuff to say.
So here's what we have to go to, and this is why it's so critical. This is why the person of Jesus is so critical. So anything that I say can be manipulated however you might. I'm not accusing you of this. I'm just saying that anything that I say can be manipulated by you to mean essentially about whatever you want it to say. If we have a very long conversation, all you can say, well, he said this, and he said this, and he said this. You can kind of control that to mean what you want it to mean.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
it's a giant game of telephone.
The key
That's all history is.
to actually understanding what is being said by a person is to know that person. So the better you know someone, the less you misinterpret them.
Okay. I can definitely understand that when it comes to a personal sense.
Yeah, we misinterpret. Even when we want to understand, we misinterpret because of a lack of knowledge of the person, usually. So Jesus had to come so that we could see the person of God, so we could see his character and his spirit. And through that knowledge, understand the message that God has for us. And that's why to me, the Bible is very ambiguous and can be understood in many ways, but ultimately, the message of the Bible is that it's only through relationship and the right spirit that you can actually understand what is being said here. It demands, it requires a relationship to live it out, to get it right.
And what does that relationship look like to you?
Ultimately, that's what God...
Oh, I'm sorry. You can continue with what you're saying.
What's that?
I was just wondering what that relationship looked like to you.
Well, yeah. Let me make this statement, and I'll get right to that.
Oh, go for it.
That's why God created us. That's why God created us, was to have a relationship with us.
Mm-hmm. That's
why he made us in his image. Anyway, so what does that relationship look like to me? To me, that relationship looks like a good father-son relationship.
With you and God?
Which is the message of the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
That's right, between me and God.
Okay.
And
so how do you personally experience
I would
this?
say that's... What's that?
How do you personally experience this kind of relationship with, God and Jesus? Or just God?
So, initially, it was through realizing how badly I had messed up my life by doing things the way that I thought I ought to do them.
Mm-hmm. And how was that? What was that?
Damaging relationships that were very valuable to me. And then also just recognizing that I knew so little of the world that how was I going to ever get it right unless I had a much broader a perspective that was way beyond myself.
Mm-hmm.
And from that perspective, I started reading the Gospels. And through reading the words, the teachings, and seeing the life of Jesus in the Gospels, I saw myself, he described who I was within, and identified that what he was saying was true about who I was as a person.
That's
And then he gave me the answer to that. And when I began to pursue the answer, which was the Spirit of God dwelling within me, then I experienced a tremendous transformation of how I viewed the world and how I viewed other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was the foundation of the relationship. And then since then, it's been through a variety of ways that I have met God and learned about Him. So both through reading the Bible more, but also through experience and seeing how His Word has developed my life and how it's true about the world and how it describes reality as it is.
Mm-hmm. So
I tend a little bit more. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think it's lovely that it managed to connect with you like that, even when you're going through such a dark time. As you're saying, cutting yourself off from these people and like destroying these relationships, and you found solace through the Bible. So, were you raised Christian then, or is this just something that you found through your hardships?
So, my parents would have been Christians, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But as I moved through my teen years, I was pretty rebellious.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of tried to do things my own way, essentially. And it took me basically releasing everything for me to be able to come to the place that I'm describing to you. Definitely releasing my own way, but then also releasing an honest, complete pursuit of the truth. Like when I went to the Gospels, it was just like, I've got to find out what these are actually saying.
Mm-hmm.
But
so you had that
curiosity.
So you had that curiosity before you even like went into it. You had that curiosity. You had that like interest to learn more about it. And like what really resonated with everybody. Because you've learned about it as a kid. Is that essentially what you're going for here? It's like it was there, but then you had that drive to really push towards it.
Yeah. So I really had to start. I really opened myself up,
mm-hmm.
but at the same time, that was part of the framework of, okay, so I've got to test this. I've got to see what's really here, because essentially when I say I was rebellious, I kind of did things my own way.
What would that entail, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, so essentially it was kind of like I did a lot of outward things that I thought were right and good, even from a Christian perspective. But I was controlling my future.
Mm-hmm.
So while I was kind of trying to, do things that I thought were right and good, like be a good person, at the same time I was trying to control where I ended up. Mm-hmm. And so I was doing a lot of quote Christian things, but I was not really Christian.
Yeah, you didn't really truly devote yourself to Christianity at that time. You were like Christian, but you weren't.
Exactly.
Yeah. So would you say that you went down like a dark path, or was it just down like a rebellious path and more of like a separation from the faith? I mean, I'm sure in your perspective now it may seem dark compared to what you have going on, but would you have considered it dark times while you were in there?
Some of it pretty dark, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Especially in relation to, kind of depends what you mean by dark. Like if you mean by dark as in like getting involved in really evil stuff, not so much that as just like struggling with, doubt and some depression and things like that. Yes, I definitely would have dealt with that, especially in some of my relational challenges.
Did you ever do any drugs
Hopelessness.
or like alcohol? Did you ever drink a lot?
No, I never did. No.
Mm-hmm.
So didn't go down those paths really. Just
Mm-hmm.
just more the struggle of spirit, I would say.
Yeah.
Of realizing that things just weren't going good and I couldn't figure them out, and it just felt hopeless at times, and yeah.
Now, Phil, I have a quick question for you, if you don't mind me asking. Where are you from?
Sure. I live in Virginia.
Virginia, really? Where at?
Harrisonburg, Virginia area.
How close is that to Fort Lee?
I don't know. I don't know that.
Oh man, that's the only area I'm familiar with in Virginia.
Along Interstate 80. Yeah, we're along Interstate 81, about an hour south of Winchester. About 2 hours north of Roanoke.
Okay. I'm not. You're speaking a different language. I'm not familiar with Virginia in the slightest.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I'm not sure where Fort Lee is.
Yeah, no, that's no problem. I was just kind of curious. Did you grow up with a lot of siblings, Philip?
5 siblings.
Oh, damn! You got me beat by one. I grew up with 4. So what is it?
Okay.
So then, what is it? Essentially, just quick question then. So like when you really did, find yourself on this path of like Christianity, is that when you started to reject things like old earth and things like that, like and along those lines, or did you already have creationism, or was like the old earth ideals, and then also just quite literally seeing everything in the Bible as truth? Like, were those still a part of you, or did they like kind of disappear with the sense of like? Are you kind of seeing what I'm getting at? Did you kind of go into a more secular mindset during this rebellious time, and then you went back into the creationist, full Bible, everything is true?
Yeah, I would say probably it was really kind of an interesting journey, because I would have been raised pretty conservative Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Actually very conservative Christian.
What's the denomination?
And so,
Mennonites, gotcha.
I don't know if you've
familiar.
probably heard of Amish.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the Anabaptists.
Okay. Yep, that's right.
Yep. So you were raised that way, and then where are you at now?
I'm still Mennonite. I'm not part of the same conservative group
Mm-hmm.
that I was before, but I am Mennonite, and essentially I would say that when I really experienced God, at that point I was ready to throw all of this conservative Christian stuff out the window, because I thought that it had essentially deceived me into looking at the wrong things, and that's why I hadn't found Christianity. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. That definitely makes sense.
So essentially, I had this transformational experience with God, and all of a sudden it was like everything is up for grabs. Like there's absolutely nothing that I believed before that has any real grip on me, because this is something that's totally new and totally different. And so I went back to the Bible almost ready, if you will, to throw away anything that I didn't find of value. And so it was, and I did. I did end up putting behind me many things that, I'm not at the same place that I was before. There were things that I just said, no, this isn't the message of the Bible. Mm-hmm. This isn't what God is saying. And so I did actually get rid of a fair amount of things that were relating to the way that I grew up and the way that I understood the Bible. Mm-hmm. And as far as my view of earth, I would have been raised with a very a very, very strong young earth perspective. Like, this is the only way to believe perspective.
Did you feel any pressure from your parents or your family when you were making this transition, or in order to make this transition back to the church?
There were definitely concerns, but there was also understanding about the what I was going through. So yeah, I mean, it was definitely a time of difficulty because we were working through with family members differences that we were seeing about perspective. And part of it again, was where I was at least at one point, was ready to throw everything away. Well, they were concerned about that because they didn't know where I was going to end up. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so that's a natural concern of any parent. And so we definitely would have felt some of that, but also we felt understanding and support at some levels as well. Definitely love through it all.
Yeah, of course.
Definitely a lot of love.
Of course.
And so yeah.
So what is it? When you're saying you've gone back to a conservative Christian mindset, so what you mean by that is you're saying young earth, everything that is said in the Bible is true, and would that also say that kind of dictates or has a influence on your views of the world today and everything going on? So let's just take for example gay marriage and just the whole LGBT community in general. What is kind of your perspective on that, and what is this something that was different during this rebellious time period, or was this something that has been with you this entire time?
Yeah. Well, I would say definitely I disconnected myself from my past and built my life from my early 20s when I had that experience. I've built my life around my understanding of who Jesus is. And so that's been the model for what I've built my life around the past 23 years. 23 was too long. 20 years would be more accurate. And so I would say that the positions that I have, while I see the connection and reasoning for why they existed in my growing up years and where that comes from, and even in my conversations with, say, my dad, who's still part of that conservative community, we can see across the difference, if you will, and understand it, and understand why it's there. Those differences are there.
What do you mean by that?
I don't feel like,
if you don't mind elaborating.
well, essentially, yeah. So essentially, where they came from. So a lot of things changed between 1900 and 2000. A lot of things changed. We
Absolutely.
went from
Industrial revolution. Yeah, I get what you're going on.
Driving horses, just the whole industrial revolution, all of that just exploded
And then
in the 20th century. And so people of faith struggled to respond to all those changes, in part because every external change that we make has an impact on what we believe. That's true for every person. And so as people of faith, making changes then has an impact on belief. Well, what impact is that going to have? What impact does evolution in education, what impact does that have on
your belief?
Yes. It definitely does have an impact. You might believe there is no God, for instance. You might believe
I don't believe that.
that the world came to be in a different way. So all those things are influences, and different people, based on their psychological makeup, respond to those changes differently, and that's a large part of why those differences are there between, say, my dad and myself, and even our interpretation of the events of history.
Yeah.
And the events of the 20th century.
So when it comes to like events of the 20th century and like the perspectives of your dad compared to yours, what are those perspectives specifically when it comes to like homosexuality, for example? Like how would you, like let's say a homosexual person called, and how would you treat them? What is your opinion on them, and kind of what do you want to achieve with your conversation with them?
Yeah. So essentially what I want to achieve with my conversation with them is that I can point them to learning to know who Jesus is.
Mm-hmm.
Because I am not, I have my own needs. Every person has their own desires that are outside the frame of God's plan. I'm not excluded from that. I have those desires as well.
And you think homosexuality is one of those desires?
Yes, I do.
And why is that?
And
Philip, you there?
I'm trying to think how to.
Oh yeah, no,
I'm here.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
trying to think how to frame this properly.
Yeah, of course. Take your time.
God created our sexual desires are one of the most powerful desires that we have as human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And just as kind of a quick, this is evidence of that, is the fact that probably at least, and this is very conservative, at least 75% of the calls that I take on this line, and I've taken several thousand over the past couple of years, at least 75% of them sexuality comes up in the conversation.
Of course.
Now, it's a hot button issue right now. And so but it's always been a hot button issue. It's always, in every culture, sexuality is a big issue. God is concerned about truth, not just for me, but he's concerned about truth across time. And that means that we need stability generationally for that truth to be moved across time. He's made us participants in the burden of carrying truth across time.
So you're saying in
and
like terms of lineage.
Within that.
So procreation for terms of lineage. Like
Right.
So there's more people.
That's
so
right.
like here's the thing though, when you like for example, if you look at like America today, America is a first world country. It is quite well off. There's really, I mean, we have people that are having kids left and right, and we have people that are having kids and even leaving up for adoption or just do not care about them. Then when you have something like a homosexual couple, this is something that society is kind of in need for when we have what we are currently dealing with right now. When we have a bunch of kids with no parents, and when you have two parents, whether or not they're two guys or two women, they will love that child because they chose to literally take that child rather than having it out of wedlock or having it with somebody that they don't want to be with for the rest of their life, and they don't have this commitment to have this kid. When you have these homosexual couples who do have this commitment, so I can definitely understand the lineage sense when it comes to like a small tribal society like how Israel was back in the day when this was all written, or even in ancient Rome in that sense. Because I mean, what is it? The New Testament, it was originally written in Greek. And Greece is very familiar with homosexuality because they had a pretty advanced society, and it's just essentially what I'm getting at is times change, and people are more comfortable with their sexuality now for a reason. It's because we live in a comfortable society, and people can actually be significantly more open with themselves. It's not a whole survival thing where you have to, really drive home that lineage. No, you can just live and love and enjoy your life. And, it's just, for things like that, like, for example, like, do you think homosexuality, do you think it is something that is born in a person, or it is something that their environment influences them to become homosexual? Like, because I can definitely understand how, like, greed and lust and things like that, that can definitely come from an environment when you see things like pornographic ads all the time, or, you have this entire, country that's built on you need to make money. But then homosexuality, do you see this as one of those things where it's like a society influences that, in your opinion, a sin?
Okay, so I want to step back, and I really appreciate what you're bringing out, because I think it's part of it. It needs to be part of this discussion. And so, but I want to step back into what you were saying, and I want to frame something you're talking about with our society today. So you talked about, you might have this homosexual couple that really want this child and want to, do the best for this child and whatever. Then you have these other people that, don't care about the child, that child out of wedlock, whatever. Okay? So everything that you described there, every one of them, was outside of God's plan and is every bit as wrong as homosexuality. In other words, having a child out of wedlock is just as wrong as homosexuality. So all of those things are outside of this goal of God to see this stability and generational truth being passed across time. So I'm not picking out homosexuality like so much of the American church has done and said, this is worse than divorce. This is worse than
You're saying it's broader than just homosexuality.
Sex before marriage. No, it's not. I'm not pulling that out and saying that that's worse. I'm saying we need to look at what God actually says and base it on that. The church does. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the church does. The church needs to stop making a distinction between people who aren't faithful to their partners in a marriage between a man and a woman, and just pull out something about homosexuality and say, "Oh, this is this huge problem." Now, so let's jump that forward then, and let's look at the question that you just posed, which is, do I think that homosexuality is born into a person, or is it something that the environment creates? And I would say it is both. It can be both.
Okay.
But one of the things that's very interesting to me is, in the people that I've worked with, the people that I've counseled in relation to homosexual desires, there's often a link between that and their relationship with their parents, and specifically their dad, for both men and women, specifically with their father.
You're saying you got this link from your personal experience?
What's that?
You're saying you got this, like, what is it? You came to this conclusion through your, like, personal experience of, like, the calls that you've been on?
Well, calls that I've been on, but also with people that I've related to personally that have experienced homosexual desires personally. Now, that doesn't mean that it's all conclusive. I'm not making that statement. What I'm saying is that I've seen that link. And that, in essence, then steps back to this whole thing of stability in the family unit being part of the progression. And also in Roman society, a very, very immoral society, and progressively became more and more homosexual as it moved along in that progression of immorality. Now, again, I'm not lifting out homosexuality. I'm just saying that that's a pattern. And what I really want to be clear about is the fact that I do believe, well, first of all, I believe that we are born with a tendency towards selfishness and self-gratification. We are born with very strong sexual desires. We are born into a world that has experienced a lot of decay as a result of the sin and fallenness of humanity for thousands of years. And so, yes, I believe that people are born with desires that are outside of God's plan, including some people that are born with a tendency towards homosexuality.
So how is it outside of God's plan if they're born with it then?
Well, it's also outside of God's plan for me to have sex with every woman that I find attractive.
Yes, but you're not born with that.
And I'm born with that desire.
You just said that, what is it? If they're born with that desire, God gave them that desire, and then says that this desire is wrong. It's like, because I definitely understand your societal argument to a certain extent, but something like that where it seems like God is almost condemning these people if you're saying that he gave them these desires, these homosexual desires, and they're not even evil desires in the sense that like if you're going out and having sex with every woman, you are going out and forming attachment with these people and leaving them. You're hurting these people and hurting yourself in the process. When somebody that's homosexual, they'd want a man that is gay is going to want a partner to stay with for the rest of their lives that is also gay. It's not evil in the sense that, you're going around and sleeping with a bunch of women. It's not, of course you may see it as evil because it is, forbidden in the Bible, but it's not inherently evil at all.
Well, I understand where you're coming from, and it's the most solid argument that can be made, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as what I've heard, for promoting homosexuality as something that is positive. However, I would say the statistics don't particularly agree with it. Homosexual people, on average, have more partners than people who are heterosexual. From an average perspective, the other aspect of it is too that my point was that we are born with desires.
Mm-hmm.
And the fulfillment of those desires is not always according to God's plan. And the other aspect of it is, too, that we, just because there is evil in the world doesn't mean that God created evil.
Except that it does say that God created evil in Isaiah.
Well, it does say that, but it's not referring to the sense that he is initiating evil. It's the same, similar concept to the fact that it says in the book of James that God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But then it also says that God tempted Abraham. And the better description of that would be that he tested him, or a better word for that. Or he brought a test into his life.
Mm-hmm.
But
so once again, going back to the interpretations.
It does. That's right. Which goes back to what is the nature, what is our view of the nature of who God is? And then that brings us back to what is our view of who Jesus is. And if we connect that the person of Jesus demonstrates the nature of God, then the foundation of our interpretation of the Word of God is the character and person of Jesus.
Okay.
And so that's, and then that's the framework for the understanding of the Bible. And even the New Testament itself says that it's only through the right spirit that we properly understand and interpret the Word.
So let's dive into that real quick, just a little bit. So, like, for example, when we're talking about evil, so this is like let's take Hitler for example. You know, Hitler is the most evil person you could possibly think of. When you think of the word evil, you think of the word Hitler. All right, and you're saying that salvation through Jesus Christ would allow, you know, for that sweet spot in heaven in the afterlife. So, somebody like Hitler, is it possible for salvation for him? After all
maybe not.
After all of the crimes that he committed, and he gives his life to Jesus, he says sorry for everything that he's done, and he prays every day after that, and then he dies, you know, in some sort of alternate history. Hitler dies as a man of Christ. You know, where's his spot?
Yeah. So the Bible speaks to, the New Testament specifically speaks to the fact that if we reject God.
I'm sorry, could you, where in the Bible is, or where in the New Testament does it say this? I have my Bible right here. I'd like to look at this.
Sure. Let me look up the text.
Yeah,
so that I'm not giving you the wrong text here.
Perfect. And do you use the King James Version, correct?
I do, but I'm not. I don't feel like we need to be limited to that. If you want to use another translation, I use others as well. I'm loading my Bible app so I can use the search bar. Having a mental blank on the wording. Give me a minute.
Yeah, no worries. Take your time.
Oh man, well, I can't think of it. I know exactly what Jesus says. The denunciation of the Spirit is the only sin that's unforgivable, and I can't come up with the wording.
Oh, it's all right. It's all right. Just essentially get into what your point was for that.
Yeah.
I can look at the
So,
Bible.
and that's not the only one that there is, but that's the one that I'm trying to come up with. My point with it is that no man can come to the Father except the Spirit draw him. Okay? So that's one indication of the work of God's Spirit. But then Jesus says the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. There we go. Is the sin that will not be forgiven. So the rejection of the Spirit of God is what will not be forgiven. And so the idea between those two passages, the idea is that the Spirit of God is drawing the hearts of men, and that's the way that we come to God. But if we spurn that connection, that there is a possibility we'll reach the place where our conscience will be seared and we will not be able to just say, we can't just say, I'm sorry, and it's all better. There's a corresponding relationship that if we push that away and push that away and push that away, that we can't just turn that around.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying there's like a point of no return?
I don't exactly.
So
yeah.
Now here's the problem with that, though, is that so Hitler throughout his life thought he was a man of God. I mean, there's been multiple quotes. I mean, here, let me just pull one up right now. Hitler, God. Because here, quotes. So, here's a quote from Adolf Hitler. My feeling as a Christian points me to my Lord and Savior as a fighter, points me to the man who once in lowliness, surrounded only by a few followers, recognized these Jews for what they were and summoned men to fight against them, who God's truth was greatest not as a sufferer but as a fighter. In a boundless love as a Christian and as a man, I read through the passage which tells us how the Lord at last rose in his might and seized the scourge to drive out the temple, the brood of vipers and adders. How terrific was his fight against the Jewish poison. Today, after 2,000 years, with deepest emotion, I recognize more profoundly than ever before the fact that it was for this he had to shed his blood upon the cross. So something like that. He thought of his life as an entirely true Christian because he read the Bible differently. And then he killed millions of people, or was responsible for the spearheading of that. So he considered himself a man of God his entire life. And then he dies. I mean, let's just say, because I know suicide is, a guaranteed spot in hell. So let's just say he didn't commit suicide. Let's just say he was killed. And, then he devoted his life for Jesus afterwards. So he lived his life, believing that he was doing this through Jesus. And then afterwards, after the war started settling in, he says, okay, I'm giving up this whole war thing. I'm going to, devote my entire life to God here. And then does that, it's just ambiguous on where this guy would end up.
Well, that's why the ultimate judgment of the soul of a human being is in the hands of God, not in our hands. And it's at that level that we're told not to judge in the New Testament. Because we can make up an innumerable number of hypothetical scenarios. In fact, it would be really interesting to me to know at what point in Hitler's life the quote you just read was made. because there was a shift in Hitler's position on religion as his political career moved, and he was very pro-Christian in his early statements, and
It was from 1922.
You say 1922?
Yes.
Okay. I was trying to find a quote that I'm not even going to quote it until I know that it was him for sure that said it, which I'm not finding it currently, but about his goal to raise a new generation. And I'm pretty sure it was him, but there is a possibility it may have been Stalin, which was an equally, if not more so, person of great evil.
Mm-hmm. It's just it's the fact that Hitler can use the Bible to justify his actions definitely points to a problem with the Bible, though. Wouldn't you agree? You know, when it comes to just different interpretations. You know, like you could use, for example, like the slaughter of the Canaanites. You can use that to justify your horrific acts. And of course, it's not in line with what Jesus says, but it's in line with what everything else before him says. And Jesus said that he's coming there to fulfill the Old Testament.
Well, I see your point, but I'd have to say that there are many quotes used as justification for things that we do not particularly blame the person who made the original statement for them, their quotes being used for nefarious means or misinterpreted, clearly misinterpreted.
Why is it so clear?
And ultimately, what's that?
Why is that so clear? Why is it so clearly misinterpreted?
Well, because Jesus said, love your enemies.
Mm-hmm. But then God smited his enemies in the Old Testament.
But that was not his ultimate goal.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that those deaths were necessary for Jesus to come about?
Well, the people that have a problem with God are people who, okay, no, I shouldn't say it that way. Let me say it this way.
Okay.
Many people that I've talked to that have a problem with God, they want God to stop evil, but they also want him to not have done it with any use of
Force
that ended any people's lives.
Mm-hmm. So why wasn't God able to forgive, like, what is it? What was the one, what's the city that Abraham came across and had to find one good person out of it? Was that Moses? It was like the one good person to find the city. That's not Sodom and Gomorrah. That's... Do you know what city that was?
Oh, yeah. Sodom and Gomorrah was where he asked if there were 5 or...
No, I believe...
Started out with, 20 or something like that, or 50?
The one where one of the daughters...
City?
The one where the daughters were turned to... The one daughter was turned to stone for looking back at the city.
Yeah, that was Sodom and Gomorrah.
That was Sodom and Gomorrah? Okay, perfect. So, then with that, so like why were they deemed so evil that they had to die? Isn't, God all about forgiveness? Why how did he know in his infinitesimal plan that if they strayed away from God's plan, then he doesn't know what they're doing. All right? He doesn't know what they're doing, that means he's not all knowing. And if he's all knowing, that means that them being evil is a part of God's plan. And then he smited them knowing that he'd smite them and knowing that he would kill them. And he created them to kill them.
God created us with choice, with the freedom to choose, to love him or to turn away from him. And that's what makes the deepest form of love possible. And every person has the freedom to choose. And ultimately, God is the judge of that opportunity.
Mm-hmm. So did God know that this was going to happen? Did God know that he was going to kill all of these people? Did God know that he was making this entire city full of wicked, evil people, men, women, children, babies? He knew that these babies were going to be evil because they had the free will to choose as a baby. Did he know this and then, willfully kill them?
I don't believe that God makes people evil.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be hard to make a case that God makes people evil.
Then why did he kill everybody that was evil? So if he knew that they were going to be evil.
The discussion between God and Abraham had to do with the men in the city.
Mm-hmm.
The ones who were to be the leaders, the ones who were to shape the coming generations.
Yes.
And so God's actions are clearly stated in relation to the flood, in relation to Sodom and Gomorrah, in relation to the Canaanites. It was him suppressing, stopping the sinfulness
mm-hmm. By killing
of those.
Instead of going there and revealing himself. Did he reveal himself to these people? Because if killing is just... Was that?
At some level, yeah.
So like the angels then.
Noah preached to the people before the flood.
Noah did, but did God do it? Did God do it specifically? Not Noah, through God, but God coming and saying, hey, there's a flood coming, stop being wicked or you're all gonna die. Why didn't God do that? He basically plotted on the entire world's downfall. Because he knew that these people were going to be evil, and he knew that these people were not going to have a chance of forgiveness. So he killed them all.
Do you know that they didn't have a chance of forgiveness?
Do I know? Do you know? I don't know. I believe they could have had a chance at forgiveness.
Okay. Do you know that they didn't?
Apparently God did, because he killed them all.
Because Peter says that Jesus went and preached to the spirits in prison.
Mm-hmm.
After his death.
Okay.
So
Not familiar with
ultimately, the part of the question is, does God need to meet our terms in relation to telling us exactly what he did or didn't do in relation to people who were accountable to him before we are willing to accept who he revealed himself to be.
Okay.
And Jesus didn't come to authenticate the killing of people. Jesus came to fulfill the revelation of who God is.
Okay.
And inability to be who he ought to be by himself. And Jesus came to bring a final revelation that man needed God to be who he should be. Because the arguments that you're using to say that God isn't good, the same arguments could be used for atheistic Russia to say that no God isn't good.
Okay. So what exactly are you getting at there? What's the... I mean, it's...
Well, our judgment of our judgment of God's moral character does not disprove his existence. So even if we would determine that God is bad, if we would, that doesn't disprove that he exists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
I can agree with that. It just doesn't... It just proves that he's not all good. It definitely doesn't disprove that he exists, but it does disprove that he's all good.
Unless he created us to be good, and we have the capacity to mess things up.
Okay. So God didn't mess up when he destroyed that city?
What's that?
So God didn't mess up when he destroyed that city or the entire world? Or Sodom and Gomorrah specifically?
So the question I would have in response to that is, are we big enough to answer that question?
I mean, no, because we don't really know where this story comes from. I mean, if we're saying that, like, what is it? I've got the story right in front of me right now. So, like, if we're talking about just a question of morality, whether our morality is better than God's morality, which you don't believe it is, God's morality, said Lot was the only righteous person in the city of Sodom. And Lot offered up his, was it 2 virgin daughters? Yes, 2 virgin daughters to sleep with the rapists. Not sleep with, get raped by the rapists in place of the angels. So, and then he turned one of them to stone when she looked back at the city when it was being destroyed. So, why is that the good person from God's standpoint? Because like you and I, we can see somebody like that. If I met somebody who offered up his 2 virgin daughters, to a bunch of rapists, then I would not consider that person to be a good man. Is God's judgment different? How is that any better than what our judgment is?
Interestingly, our judgment here in the Western world,
Mm-hmm.
is primarily based on the values that Jesus presented
Okay.
as a response to as a presentation the Judeo-Christian value system. And I'm not saying that we don't draw from any other sources in our views of morality. But our perspective of what is good is anchored at some level in a Judeo-Christian worldview, and primarily a Christian worldview.
I was going to say, because if it's Judeo, then it's a lot more ambiguous of God's goodness. I mean, if you just pick out Jesus,
it's more specifically. Yeah.
So if it's framed around that framework, then how come me, as somebody who's living in the Western world, sees this and sees, wow, this is a bad person?
Because primarily you're pointing back to what God is pointing out happens when we don't have Him.
Like
And
giving up our daughters to rapists?
He's not specifically condoning.
He called
God
them
doesn't
righteous.
specifically condone everything. He doesn't specifically condone everything that every person does.
But he was the only righteous man in that city. It's probably going to have babies in it. I consider babies to be righteous. Love me a good righteous baby.
We're talking about men. In other words, we're talking about men, not particularly babies.
Mm-hmm.
But my point is that God's perspective about what righteousness is not a perspective of an individual's perfection, but it has to do with what a person loves and where they're going. And the direction that they're moving. And so I understand what you're saying, but I'm not sure that if you remove the Judeo-Christian God from your worldview, that it's possible for you to end up in a place that has any capacity for morality at all.
Okay, so like, for example, let's take a look at, what is it, ancient Native Americans. I mean, not even that ancient. Let's look at Native Americans who do not have that Judeo-Christian value. Would you say that they were good people?
At some level, yes.
Without the Judeo-Christian values.
With a structure that's created into humanity.
Ah, there it is.
And okay,
There it is. Moral structure created into.
so where did that come from?
I mean, I guess the answer you're hoping that I point to is God, which, I mean, I would agree with that. You know, is it we all come from God, and the way I interpret that is probably very different from you. But, so, like, for example, let's take the Native Americans. Oh, you know what? Let's just go back to the Israelites real quick. When it comes to, you know, the Judeo-Christian values and the Bible, you know, it all came out of, you know, Israel and Palestine. And then it spread, you know, specifically through Europe, a little bit through Asia, and then through Africa as well, you know, through Ethiopia. And so why is it that God only revealed himself to one half of the world? You know, when you have an entire half of the world over across the waters, why didn't he reveal himself to them?
Well, if you do a study of church history, you'll see that by 600 A.D., the gospel was well over into China, India,
Yep.
and the eastern part of the world.
Yes.
But ultimately, if you go to the book of Romans, you'll see that God reveals himself to every person.
Ah. Really? Do you know the verse for that one? I'm really curious to read that one.
Yep. I know where this one's at.
Perfect. Perfect.
For one, here in our discussion, I know where it's at.
And where would that be?
It is Romans 1 and verse 18. No, sorry.
Oh.
19. Romans 1:19.
Okay, 119. That's good. Romans 1:18.
And 20.
Okay. There you go. There you go. That's a lot nicer than Romans 18.
1:19 and 20.
All right. So, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. So then with that is a perfect verse to bring up, because now I'm curious about, do you think it's possible that, let's say, the Native Americans, you know, they experienced God, you know, if it was made plain to them by, you know, the way that I personally see God. I see God in nature. I see God in people. I see God in the accomplishments of people. I see God in literally everything. So, with that, do you think it's possible that the Native Americans saw God and then interpreted God differently? And then the Israelites, you know, they had their interpretation of how they saw God. And then just made their own, you know, humanistic view about them, about God.
Well, you could certainly take that position. And many people do. Many people have, I believe, and many people do. But I think in part there's a very romanticized view of what many of those cultures were like,
such as Israel's culture
outside of Christianity, and some of them were reasonably good, but some of them were very evil. and or what we would consider evil. And so, you can certainly take that view and hang your hat on that view if that's what you want to do. You have the freedom to do that. That's what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
But
I'd kind of take that view with this context of Romans 1:19. Once again, just my interpretation of it.
But the fully represented righteousness of God is revealed in Jesus. And that comes 3 verses before.
What was it, Romans 1:16 then?
Yeah, 16 and 17.
The righteous shall live by faith.
16 talks about, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation to everyone that believeth, the Jew first and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith.
The righteous will live by faith, so to live specifically through that church.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I caught what you said there.
No, it's alright. I didn't say much there. I was just reading the passage. So, okay. Then on top of that, so if God is only, what is it? The righteous will live by faith. That God brings salvation for everyone who believes, first to Jew, then to Gentile. So with that, what about everybody who, is a Gentile? So let's say everybody who lived before Jesus or lived during the time of Jesus, like let's say, Native Americans. I've been bringing up the Native Americans a decent amount, who did not have access to Jesus, who didn't even have access to the Israelite interpretation of God. It does not seem right that now, if I don't believe in God, I get sentenced to hell. But then for them, since they quite literally had no possible belief in God because it wasn't revealed to them through the Bible, would they get sentenced to hell then as well? Or would God rightfully judge them?
I believe, God says I shouldn't say time and time again, but God says that he's righteous, and he judges righteously.
Mm-hmm.
And so I believe that every person will be judged on the basis of the opportunities that they had and the choices that they were given. Mm-hmm. And I leave that judgment in the hands of God. He was the one who created. He was the one who made things as they are. And so he has the whole picture in view, and he has the whole of every life in view. Jesus says he has the hairs, even the hairs of our head are numbered. And so he has the whole perspective, and he judges from that whole perspective. And that's why he tells me not to judge that individual, because I don't have that same picture.
Okay. So, you don't judge anybody then?
I judge myself.
Okay. Yeah, everybody judges themselves. I judge myself all the time. We are all built on judging ourselves because we are in our own minds all the time. So, yeah. Judging yourself can definitely be some good things that can come out of that, but at the same time, some really bad things. It's nice to let go sometimes. But So
we
it just
we have to have we have to have the proper framework of seeing ourselves.
Mhm.
That's the part of this. Our mistakes, our failures sometimes come out of our limitations as well. And so when we recognize that we're limited, then that helps us to let go when it's appropriate.
Okay. Okay.
So you said you asked the question so you don't judge anyone. And I would say it this way. I don't believe it's right for me to condemn.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that it is my responsibility to judge between right and wrong for my own life, as well as to speak to what I see as right and wrong in response to what God has done for me. And I'm not saying that in the sense of, I'm trying to say that in the same sense that Jesus said to the woman who was caught in adultery, "Neither do I condemn you, go and sin no more." He didn't bring condemnation on her, but rather he said there are proper ways to live that are important and that matter.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to make those judgments about that there are proper ways to live. But I don't think it's my job as a Christian to condemn.
Mm-hmm. There's proper ways to live according to the Bible.
Well, I would say that you have expressed that there are proper ways to live.
Yeah.
And improper ways to live.
It's the golden rule. Treat others how you would like to be treated.
Okay. Okay. So, there are proper ways to live.
Mm-hmm. Just don't hurt people.
You and I agree on that.
Yeah.
So, I believe that we need to make those judgments.
Mm-hmm.
For ourselves and express those in communication with other people.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think that if we just spoke in relation to what we believe are those right ways to live, there wouldn't be many ways that we would actually disagree. There would be a few. In some senses, one of them would be about what the meaning of love is, what it means to love, but
what do you think it means to love?
many of the things that you're saying, self-sacrifice.
I can agree with that. I can absolutely agree with that.
So, anyway, it's been an interesting conversation.
It has. I will absolutely agree, Philip. Well,
I've appreciated the way we've been able to discuss this rationally.
Yeah, of course. Of course, because what's the point of arguing for anything? We're not going to get anywhere with that.
That's right.
Live through love.
That's right. So, yeah. Well, thanks for calling.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for, having this conversation with me, Philip.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Yep. All right. I wish you the best.
Thank you, Philip. I love you. Have a great night.
You as well. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Oh, he didn't say he loved me too. All right. Well, my camera's dead. I probably put a little disclaimer on that. But yeah, I really do love these conversations. I love learning about these people. I love just learning about all people because, we're all just people. We are all just people. you might see the signs like this one right here and immediately get upset. Then you kind of have to understand where these people are coming from and kind of break it down a little bit. Get them to question it. Because, all it is love. That's all it is. So, on that note, I love you all. Thank you so much for listening. And, I've said this in the beginning. Like, comment, subscribe, do all that fun stuff. I really hope you enjoyed this conversation. I'd be really surprised if you made it to the end of this. This is my first ever video with this type of content. And yeah, please reach out too if you just want to talk. That's my kind of thing. I enjoy talking, if you couldn't tell. Been talking for almost 2 hours now. But yeah, once again, I love you all and have a great night. Or day, or shit, I don't know. I hope you finish your laundry at this point. Alright, thanks for being here. See ya.